You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Monday evening. Doing our first show for the day. We actually have a couple lined up here. Going to be joined in just a moment by Dr. Larry Chapp. He is a retired professor. In fact, he taught for over 20 years at DeSales University. He's also the founder of the blog GaudiumEtSpes22.com, which I've been reading lately and has been really interesting, especially go and check out the one where he did his thoughts on the motu proprio. I've been finding that extremely helpful. So check that out if you are interested in the new motu proprio and want to get his thoughts. But I'm going to go ahead and bring him on. He's waiting backstage. Dr. Larry Chapp coming up next. Dr. Chapp, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I've been watching your videos for a while now, so this is a real honor.
Oh, thank you. Like I was saying in the introduction there, I was just reading your thoughts on the motu proprio, and we have some very similar views there when it comes to the motu proprio. So I can really appreciate the perspective that you take. It seems like you take a nuanced and qualified approach, which is very much what we're used to over here at Reason and Theology.
Yes, I mean, I obviously think the motu proprio was a heavy-handed way of solving a very minor problem. I don't see the problem of dissent from Vatican II all that prevalent in the traditional Latin communities that I have been associated with. And I'm not a traditionalist in that regard, and I do not attend a TLM parish. I actually attend an ordinariate parish, an Anglican ordinariate parish. But so I don't have any skin in that game, and yet I still thought the motu proprio was a strangely forensic and legalistic answer to what is in reality a very deep spiritual problem, that the motu proprio never engages in any systemic pastoral analysis or even gives the slightest hint of an awareness of what pathological spiritual conditions have existed within the church for the past 50 or 60 years, or maybe even longer, that have led people to say we need these intentional communities, if you want to call it by that cliche, in order to raise our children properly. And that's another big neglected factor here. Families are attracted to these TLM parishes for the sake of raising their children.
You know, it seems like there was a cardinal recently who effectively said that. He was, in other words, saying, look, the motu proprio is going after this particular group within Catholicism, but it doesn't really ask the question, you know, why are people not attending the Mass? So,
Really?
yeah, I think there are larger fish to fry, especially for a pope who can do something about it.
Well, especially for a pope, too, who constantly talks about, you know, and I don't want this to be a Pope Francis bash.
Sure.
I have
Sure.
very mixed, I'm not a Francis hater. I have mixed feelings about him. He's not my favorite pope of my lifetime. But nevertheless, I mean, he is a pope who talks a lot about synodality, accompaniment, you know, going to the margins, smelling like the sheep, and now, boom, this comes down, as Cardinal Mueller said, it's like the shepherd has now just hit his sheep with the crook. Right across the head, and it bespeaks. Someone said to me confidentially that they know people in Rome who say that Pope Francis was at one time in his youth a very, very traditionalist person, and he found it very debilitating to himself personally, which is why there is almost like this personal sort of tone in the motu proprio, where it's like, you know, he's going to dispatch with with these people with great prejudice in a way that he's not doing with others.
Yeah, I just wish he would do that with others.
Yeah, well, as I say that in my blog here, the Germans are spinning off into outright schism. Right. You know, should they enact what they say they're going to enact? Now, in defense of the Pope, they haven't gotten there yet. But it's pretty clear, why doesn't he just issue a motu proprio suppressing the German synodal way, saying, we see where this is headed and it's a dead end. we issued a CDF document about this, said you should stop, and you haven't, so I'm going to. I mean, and I'm not a big fan of papacies as disciplinarian, I'm not a big fan of forbidden index of books days and that sort of thing. But if you're going to wield the hammer for one group in the church, then you need to be consistent. Otherwise, you're going to be accused of ideological bias.
Seems like there's a little bit of that going on. I would agree. So we're here now talking about radical traditionalism. While there's a whole bunch of liberals out there in the church, some people are going to say, why even talk about this topic? You have all these other people who are causing havoc in the church. You have the German bishops. Why even talk about radical traditionalism? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a very, very complicated topic. And so let's start with, I think, the big picture, which is there's still an open and burning question about how to implement and appropriate the Second Vatican Council.
Right.
The papacies of John Paul and Benedict put a very particular stamp on the hermeneutics of reception, of continuity, and how they thought that it should go, especially an encyclical like Veritatis Splendor, which really set a strong tone in that regard, Evangelium Vitae. This papacy, though not repudiating that, seems to want to take a different path in its appropriation of the council. So I read its response to radical traditionalism as essentially a referendum on what direction are we going to take Vatican II. And by the same token, I view the rise of radical traditionalism as a veto on that same process. These people are saying, in a variation of post hoc ergo propter hoc, or to put it in the words of Jesus, you can know a tree by its fruits. Now, I'm a big fan of the Second Vatican Council. In fact, I'm writing a book on it in defense of it. But that being said, there's no doubt, as Benedict himself has pointed out, the council bore some pretty nefarious fruits, and so one can understand why the traditionalists are rising now, especially in the era of the internet with the Taylor Marshalls of the world. You can see why that. So you're, in other words, as I say in my blog, to me it's like deja vu all over again. You see these same strong gods, these two strong binaries that were so prevalent in my youth. I'm 62. In the 60s and 70s, between the Lefebvreite traditionalists on the one hand and the uber Jesuit progressive social justice warriors on the other. The clown mask crowd, as I call it, and with the communio resource theology that I represent, that Ratzinger represents, sort of lost in the shuffle, even though they were the primary purveyors of the theology of the council. To me, it's like this is all over again. And so I read, this is a long-winded way of saying, I read the rise of radical traditionalism today as just a newer iteration, a newer version of a binary that the council created that is still going on. Mm-hmm. Which is why a motu proprio, which is why a legal document of the church is not going to solve the problem. The problem can only be solved at its root by the church reaching a broad consensus on what the Second Vatican Council meant and how are we to appropriate it.
Seems like we've been issuing documents clarifying the Second Vatican Council, but that hasn't done it. So my opinion is we need to enforce discipline in the church, get rid of the wayward clergy, especially. What do you think about that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of top-down, papally directed disciplinary procedures, but I am a big fan of the idea that bishops on the ground need to stop hiding behind the skirts of the Episcopal Conference and start acting like bishops in their local dioceses by imposing those sorts, by excommunicating priests. You know what? I was a seminarian for 7 years. I wanted to be a priest. I did not become a priest because I chose to get married. Okay, because I was a normal, red-blooded, healthy, heterosexual male. I wanted to get married. Now, I support a mandatory celibate clergy. Don't get me wrong. I'm not arguing otherwise. But my attitude since then has been this. If I, a red-blooded, normal, heterosexual male who simply wanted to get married, isn't good enough to be a priest because I wasn't going to be celibate, then by God, have a celibate priesthood. If you're not going to have a celibate priesthood, then get the non-celibates out of there. Otherwise, start ordaining married men. Okay? Start ordaining married men who are serious about their faith. But let's stop this double life nonsense. Well, sinners will be sinners and we have to be compassionate. A priest vows celibacy. and he needs to be held to that. Now, I'm not going to come down hard and say a one-time slip up by a priest with a woman or something, fine, there's forgiveness in the church. But you know what? If you're raping 15-year-old boys, you need to be out of the priesthood. That's kind of a given.
And not only that, but if you're teaching things contrary to what the church teaches and you're obstinately doing so, you
Yes.
should also be removed. I don't care how spotless your sexual life may be.
Oh,
Your sexual
yeah,
life
yeah.
disqualifies you, but even teaching heresy is another one, or just teaching error, Catholic error.
Well, I'm glad you're going down that road because I started with the most obvious, which is the sexual deviancy, which is where bishops need to really exercise some disciplinary authority. But I couldn't agree more about, I think, especially in Catholic colleges and universities that exist within major dioceses that are completely riddled with theological dissent. Look, you're studying in the Theological Guild, getting a PhD. I was in the Theological Guild for a long time. You and I both know the landscape. You and I both know how riddled with theological dissent the Catholic Academy still is and has been for 50 or 60 years. Pope
Mhm.
John Paul issued Ex Corde Ecclesiae, the document that was meant to reform this process. But once again, it's a juridical document. A juridical document isn't going to solve what is at root a deep spiritual problem that bishops on the ground need to address through
Yeah.
some disciplinary action. I remember down in Philadelphia, St. Joseph's College, which is a Jesuit school, every year they hold some sort of queer film festival on campus. Some drag queen film festival, queer film festival, and of course it gets a lot of publicity, and the Jesuits push it, and so on. Loyal Catholics in Philadelphia complained to then Archbishop Chapp, and Chapp essentially demurred and said, "Well, it's a Jesuit school. What the heck can I do about it? I deplore it, but they're Jesuits. What can I? There's a lot that an archbishop could do about it. You could start by getting rid of the Jesuits from your diocese. You could tell St. Joseph's University you're no longer a Catholic school in our directory, and I order every Jesuit at your school out of my city." That's how you could start right there.
And why do you think that doesn't happen? Because I just often wonder if bishops believe the Catholic faith, and that might be a big if there. Why don't they do something about this?
That's a very good question, and obviously, I think the solutions are multifocal, and because the reasons are multifocal. One reason could simply be a kind of groupthink in the episcopacy, where bishops don't really like to rock the boat or appear to be going rogue, and
Yeah.
because a culture quickly developed after the Second Vatican Council of bishops taking a more irenic and peaceful and dialogical path, that became the norm, and then any bishop that wanted to deviate from that norm, all right, would have been considered a pariah with his brother bishops, and nobody likes to be disliked by their peers. Human nature is human nature. That's part of it. The other part of it is you would get absolutely crucified in the press. Had Chapp done that, he would have been crucified in the press. Absolutely crucified. Furthermore, about half the Catholics in the diocese are of the sort of liberal, progressive, pro-Jesuit, drag queen film festival variety, and they would have created a huge stink. So Chapp and Bishop, and I don't want to pick on poor Archbishop Chapp. I think he was a halfway decent bishop, actually, and a good man. But in this regard, I didn't buy his excuse that there was nothing that could be done. But then you have to sit back and you say, okay, why don't they do it? Because I think they wonder if the remedy isn't worse than the cure. If the cure isn't worse than the disease, I'm sorry, and that maybe, just maybe, you might solve a problem of dissent at St. Joseph's University, but then you might create all kinds of backlash and headaches for you on the backside of that with blowback that might be even worse or more destructive. It's a really complex issue.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be. Now, I want to talk about both of these aspects. Catholic liberalism, which is kind of what we've been talking about so far, but also radical traditionalism in the Catholic Church. Can you define that for us? Because some people might not be familiar with the term radical traditionalism. What exactly is it?
Well, in one sense, all Catholics should be traditionalists, right? Because we
Absolutely.
believe the revelation comes through Scripture and tradition.
Right.
And when we were just discussing, one of the major problems and headaches in the church today is that there are many, many, many Catholics and Catholic theologians that are not traditionalists in any meaningful sense of that term, that they want to, in a sense, destroy the tradition in order to get beyond it into some brave new world of some redefined Catholicism, the outlines of which we can't even figure out. Okay, so we're all traditionalists in some regard. So, right. But lately, a group of traditionalists have arisen that I would say are characterized by a deep sort of romanticism about the past. I think that's one of the very defining characteristics of this. It's a romanticization of the pre-Vatican II church. Because we live in an era of turmoil, because of the exact theological dissent we were just describing, right. A group of people have decided we want to be faithful Catholics, so we need to get beyond this mess. What created this mess? Vatican II created this mess, so let's get before Vatican II. And so they romanticize that era. So traditional Catholicism is a form of Catholicism that romanticizes the pre-Vatican II church and idealizes it, and and smooths off all the rough edges that were actually there that they don't want to talk about. Second, that romanticization of that period means a radical traditionalist is going to want to really strictly adhere to the traditional Latin Mass, which is why we've seen these groups rise around the traditional Latin Mass, and not simply around more reverent celebrations of the Novus Ordo. Somebody else pointed out to me the other day, I think it was Dr. Philippa Martyr, who's a theologian in Australia. She said that the fact is you could celebrate all the reverent Novus Ordos that you want, but that's still not going to satisfy the radical traditionalists, because they really are desiring to bring back an older form of Catholicism, which would mean the traditional Latin Mass, which is why for them it's now personal. This isn't just a matter of liturgical taste. This is a life and death matter of the true church versus a less true church, let's put it that way, or a besmirched church or a dirtied church. And so there's a quest for purity in the Latin Mass, and a desire to reject theologians that I really love, like De Lubac and Balthasar and even Ratzinger, in favor of the old neo-scholastics, in favor of Gary Goulart. In other words, we need to go back to the 1930s or the 1920s. Even the 1950s were starting to get a little tainted in many of their eyes. Pius XII started to tinker with the liturgy in 1955, and that's when things started to go downhill. So you peel back that onion, and all of a sudden you're back to 1908 or 1905 and Pius X, and so on. So that's a radical traditionalist, a kind of radical romantic Catholic trying to resurrect sort of pre-Vatican II Catholicism, but in a modern way. I'm not trying to say that they're antiquarians. They are trying to bring that into our present to address our present causes. I have to say, despite the fact that I've been very critical of them on my blog, I've been very critical of the leading internet provocateurs like Taylor Marshall on my blog. I have a deep, deep sympathy with the traditionalists.
Sure.
A deep sympathy, because I think their heart and their motives are in the right place. They understand there's a deep rot in the church and something needs to be done about it. I think their solutions are romanticized and simplistic, but they're not entirely wrong, and they need to be listened to rather than slapped down.
Some of them are going to say, why don't we just push the reset button and go back to the pre-Vatican II days? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that sounds good on paper, but the fact is there were problems in the pre-Vatican II church. Let me just point out a few. Let me just speak generally. If the pre-Vatican II church was so healthy, why did it collapse immediately after the council? That would be my number one question. All of the crazy bishops and theologians and priests and so on that came out after the council were formed before the council. All the lay people that suddenly threw up their heels and said, woohoo, we can eat meat on Fridays, and we don't have to go to Mass that often anymore, and embraced the clown masses and all that. Those people were formed in the pre-Vatican II church. So if that church culture collapsed overnight, and it literally did, I lived through it, boom, that culture was gone. It evaporated in the midst of the 60s cultural revolution like that. Okay, that means that there was something wrong with the culture of Catholicism to begin with. And no less a light than Joseph Ratzinger, when he was first starting his theological career in 1958, wrote a very famous article that was a bombshell in Germany. It was called The New Paganism in the Church, in which he was already outlining the deep, deep rot that was in the Catholic Church in the pre-conciliar era. And you can look to philosophical figures like Joseph Pieper, for example, and Maritain and Gilson, who were pointing out very similar things, or literary figures like Georges Bernanos, who wrote, Diary of a Country Priest, excoriating the church of his time as a church of cultural appeasement and lukewarmness. So there was handwriting on the wall, and a mere return to the structures of the pre-Vatican II church I just don't think it's going to solve anything. Besides that, the barn door's been open and the horses are out. There might be elements of the pre-Vatican II church that we can and should retrieve, like elements of the liturgy in particular.
Yeah.
But I don't think that simply saying, hey, Vatican II got it completely wrong. It's a hot mess. Let's just set the reset, scrape Vatican II off the whole of the church like a bad barnacle, and start again. There were things Vatican II did that were very salutary. And the fact is, they haven't been implemented properly. And I know that's a tired cliche. Oh, the council was okay. It was just implemented wrong. I'll be the first to admit there are naivetes in the council that allowed it to be so manipulated. Nevertheless, there are things in the council that we need to really revisit and double down on. And I don't want to go back to the era before the church because it needed reform.
Why do you think it hasn't been implemented well?
Because I think that there were many, many, many theologians and priests and even bishops who were waiting in the wings after the council was complete to hijack it, especially in the mass media and in the academy, in order to push a radical agenda of a completely transformed Catholicism. I mean, you saw in this era Catholic theologians and even some bishops talking about how the council really did represent its own reset of the church, that it was like the church was starting again from scratch, that this was a second Reformation or the completion of the first Reformation. These are Catholics who really were Protestants in Catholic clothing, who nevertheless wanted to turn the Catholic Church into essentially a Protestant church with monasteries and high liturgy, or even not so high liturgy, and broad ecumenical goals, as well as an embracing of the moral and spiritual ethos of secular modernity, which they considered to be a good thing, not a suspicious thing. So they were waiting in the wings, and as soon as the council was done, they pounced. And it wasn't a conspiracy. I'm not Archbishop Vigano. I don't think there was a cabal of Freemasons lurking in the background, manipulating and pulling the strings. I think it was a broad cultural movement beginning in the academy that then percolated up to the bishops and many, many priests. That then, when they pounced, they overwhelmed the church with dissent that I think shocked people like Paul VI.
There's so many questions that I have here, so many different ways I want to take it. But let me maybe stick with radical traditionalism. Then I want to circle back to liberalism and Catholicism. Let me maybe ask you this. What are some of the dangers that you see right now in the radical traditionalist movement? We've kind of seen a few. You've touched on a few, but are there any others?
Well, I think there is a strong undercurrent of sede vacanteism in many radical traditionalists, more than they want to admit. I know I talked to several of them, and they'll openly talk about that they believe that this is now the great apostasy. And maybe it is. Maybe it is. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just trying to describe a mindset that could be problematic, because this breeds a kind of apocalypticism, which I think can be very, very deleterious, very dangerous if one starts to wallow in these sede vacante, great apostasy, Pope Francis is an overt heretic and a false pope, kind of Vigano-esque apocalypticisms that then get tied up with unapproved Marian apparitions and locutions and things like this. Then I think you've got the recipe for a very dangerous witch's brew of some really strange stuff that is harmful harmful to people. So that's one thing. But that's still on the fringe, though. That's not the main element in the radical traditionalist. To me, the bigger problem of the radical traditionalists is a sort of true church versus the remnant church versus a kind of watered down church, us versus them mentality that I think is insulating and insular and not optimum. I'm not going to say it's horrible or evil. I'm just saying it's not the healthiest expression of Catholicism. You hear them talk a lot about the superiority of the traditional Latin Mass to the Novus Ordo. Well, maybe it is. There's certainly elements in it that are superior to the Novus Ordo, but to weaponize the TLM like that against the Novus Ordo, I think is not good. I mean, like I said, I attend an Anglican ordinariate parish, thanks to Pope Benedict. And one of the things that I think is most striking is that I'm a cradle Catholic and I attend the ordinariate because I love its liturgy and I prefer it to the Novus Ordo. To me, it's the liturgy and the vernacular that the Council Fathers actually were looking for. So I go there for that. But there is no talk in my ordinariate parish, none, of Pope Francis is a heretic, this is a superior liturgy to the Novus Ordo, the broader church is going to hell in a handbasket, we are a remnant, little tiny remnant flock, and we are the hope for the future and only us. And so there's none of that mentality in this ordinariate church, none of it. And I think it's far healthier. It's why in many ways I chose it over my local traditional Latin Mass parish, which though good, it's a good parish, it's not a breeding ground of insanity, but those undercurrents are definitely there, and I find that uncomfortable.
Do you find those elements, however, in some parts of the traditional Latin Mass communities?
Do I find what elements in the traditional Latin Mass community?
Well, some of the ones that you mentioned about how we're the remnant church, the church is,
yes,
really wayward and things like that.
Yes, yeah, they say that they're not like that until you get them in private conversation and you find out, yeah, you kind of are. And it's and I like these people, by the way. They're friends of mine, but they come in degrees. They come in degrees from typical sort of Catholics who really aren't moved much by theology or ecclesiastical politics at all. They just like the community and they like the Mass and they're raising their kids there on that level, all the way up to, yeah, you know what, Vigano is right, the Freemasons run the church, the Pope is a false Pope, and we need to just hunker down with this Mass and fight. And
does Vigano take that perspective? Just for clarification, I'm curious because I don't know. I haven't really read a whole lot of his stuff. I've seen enough of it though. Does he take that perspective that he's a false pope?
He says that he is a heretic and that he is the leader of a false church. Vigano is very slippery and he's very careful, but his letters have gotten increasingly insane, in my view.
Yeah.
So that what he does now, he openly talks about in his letters that the council had all of these ambiguous bombshells latent within it, placed there by Freemason prelates, which were designed to explode later on in the church and to be exploited by this conspiracy of Freemason prelates and other liberals. And this created a false parallel church. Now, he says Francis is now the head of this false parallel church. I don't know. That's pretty darn close to a kind of sede vacante SSPX view. I don't even think the SSPX don't even believe in sede vacante. They think that these popes are valid popes. They think there's some communion busters here that we need to deal with before we can have communion. But none of them would be so insane as to say Pope Francis is the head of a false parallel church. And he is there, go ahead.
This is speculative on my part, but I've heard some people who say that also will say that Pope Francis is also the head of the true church, but he's also the head of this false church. I don't know if that's where Vigano lands, but what would you say to people who say that?
I think that they're trying to express in theological categories, I think something that is, for the most part, simply a sociological reality of the modern church. Namely, that there really are various rather contradictory forms of Catholicism that live side by side with one another under the same umbrella, and they are so contradictory that one wonders, how can we even call ourselves members of the same religion? And insofar as Pope Francis is the head of this deeply, deeply conflicted church on this sociological, cultural level, then he is in fact the head of both. Was it Tom Wynandy who argued this?
I think so, but I don't understand how that lines up with the relatio at Vatican I. It doesn't make sense at
Doesn't.
all. It seems to be a sea of pestilence at that point.
Well, it does, which is why I'm reducing it to I'm sort of steel manning their arguments
Right,
for
right,
them
right.
and
Sure,
saying
sure.
the best face that you could put on such a ridiculous
Right,
argument is that you're just making a sociological statement about the entrenched existence of contradictory forms of Catholicism. But you
right.
know what? That's been going on for a long time. So if Pope Francis is the head of both of those conflicting churches, so were Paul VI, Benedict, John Paul, right? And so that it almost proves too much on that level. So yeah, if you're going to say theologically the Pope is both the head of a false church and the true church, I don't even know what to make of that. I can't make any sense of that at all. It seems utterly incoherent to me on a theological level, given Vatican I, heck, given Vatican II.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
So,
But I get what you're saying. What they're trying to express is the fact that they
yeah,
see a lot of contradictions today. It's just a very poor attempt at explaining them, in
yeah,
my opinion.
yeah. What we're experiencing today is essentially the parable of the wheat and the tares on steroids.
Yeah.
And the question of what do we do with the tares?
Yeah.
Because the tares, Pope Benedict just recently, wasn't recently, I mean, a few years ago, he came out with a statement about the sex abuse crisis, and he tied it to its roots in the 1960s and so on. And he said in there that we've now sort of reached a state where the weeds, the tares, are starting to completely crowd out everything else. So we're almost getting to the point where you need to spray some Roundup on the field and look for the last remnants of any real piece of wheat that's left and nurture that. Because I run a Catholic worker farm, all right, a theologically orthodox Catholic worker farm, and so I have some experience growing crops, and it is true that sometimes you don't want to pull out the tares, the weeds, lest you damage the plants. But you do reach a critical point where you say, oh, to heck with it. This is a lost cause. The weeds have taken over, and I need to start with healthier plants and start again. And, so it goes back to your thing about more discipline in the church and what I blog about all the time, the universal call to holiness, that we need a revolution of the soul in the church right now. Big time, big time.
I hear you. This one is, I wanted to bring this one up just because I see it, and I don't want to lose it. It's a super chat from Michael Bomert. Dr. Chapp, what can be done to kill the vestiges of Land O'Lakes and the institutional devastation that has been done to Catholic universities in the United States? I really enjoy your pugnacious commentary.
I like the pugnacious description too. It's how I describe myself. And when I was a teacher, my students called me pugnacious. Here's the deal. I would say I'm just going to speak bluntly now. I can because I'm not in the academy anymore, and I can speak my mind. I would say a good 80 to 85% of so-called Catholic universities out there are Catholic in name only, and they only retain the name Catholic for fundraising purposes. And I'm not exaggerating there. You go to how they pitch fundraising things to their donor base and so on. They talk values and the church. It's nonsense. It's abject nonsense. And so what we need are for the bishops to come forward and to do us, whether as the Episcopal Conference or as individual bishops, and start issuing some directives to these colleges and universities. Say you've got 10 years to clean up your act, and it does take 10 years because you've got issues of tenure. Instead, even Father Scanlon at Steubenville took him a while to get things turned around because you have to deal with tenured professors. You just can't come in with scorched earth. So I would say the bishop say, you got 10 years, and here are the various metrics we want to see. happen over those next 10 years. And if they don't happen, we're simply going to remove your Catholic designation. Obviously, it's a free country and any school can call itself anything it wants. But we're going to remove you from the Catholic directory. We're going to remove you from the list of official Catholic universities. Then I think the bishops, in the meantime, even before that 10-year period is over, they need to start raising money and putting money into the startup of newer, more faithful, small little Catholic universities. You see this happening, little pocks of light here and there. Was that George Bush? Little points of light, 1,000 points of light, right? We need 1,000 points of light in the Catholic edusphere. And I would even go further as this. We need to be very radical about this. You want to talk about dismantling Land O'Lakes? Let's really dismantle it by saying we want to start Catholic schools in the old liberal classical tradition of great books and the classics and all that sort of thing. But we're going to do it without seeking the accreditation of accreditation agencies. And we are going to accredit ourselves. We're going to band together as a group of like-minded schools, and even among more evangelical, even Protestant religious-based schools that want to retrieve some form of classical Christianity in the educational domain. We're going to band together and we're going to form our own new way of accrediting one another. And to heck with them, because let me tell you something, the accrediting agencies are part of the problem here, in that they really do hold the feet to the fire of some of these more faithful schools. They get accredited, but it's usually a white-knuckled fight. And so we need to do that. And if you can afford it, I would go another step. I would say we're not going to take any federal money. We're not going to take any government money to run our institution, because with that money comes strings attached. Title IX, transgendered bathrooms, the whole 9 yard. We're not going to do that. So, it's a multi-step process, but it can be done, and on the grassroots level, it's already being done in some of these smaller startup little Catholic colleges.
Let's talk again about liberalism and Catholicism. You spent time in academia.
Yes.
Why in the world would somebody want to be a Catholic if they are liberal? I still don't understand it. Any thoughts here?
Liberalism, liberal Catholicism, let's put it that way, I think is non-self-perpetuating. I've been saying that for decades now, and yet it seems to perpetuate, at least among octogenarians in the hierarchy. I don't see an upswing, a groundswell, a surge of lay people, liberal Catholics around the country, not at all. In fact, the church is hemorrhaging Catholics left and right out of its parishes. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the parishes are at least beige and very liberal in many cases, and so they're hemorrhaging people. So I don't understand. I mean, if your message, and this goes for liberal Protestantism as well, if your message is the church doesn't matter, all that matters is that you're essentially a good person and you seek social justice, you don't need the church for that. You don't need Jesus for that. And so why go to church at all then? And so you start hemorrhaging members when they see through your ruse. And so on. The Jesuit Tom Rees recently had a very liberal Jesuit and not very bright. And he just recently had an essay in which he said that the Francis papacy is a failure because he's not going to outlive the episcopacy that had been put into place by John Paul and Benedict. And so his great revolution, whatever it is going to die. But then Rees said this. He said it's very interesting. He says, the problem is all new young priests, or most new young priests, are of the traditionalist variety. He goes, trying to find a young priest in the Pope Francis mold who's willing to lead a celibate life, he said, it's like trying to find a Catholic unicorn. Now, this is from Tom Rees, the liberal Jesuit, and no friend of conservative Catholicism on any level, admitting that liberal Catholicism is a dead end.
Yeah, I don't get it. I don't understand. I could think of a whole lot of other things I would rather do with my time.
Right.
Than waste my time on religion if this is a dead end and it's not true and it's just for social purposes or something like that. I can think of other things to do to form social bonds and things like that, and I can think of other
Absolutely.
things to do with my time.
Yeah.
I've never understood it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about, oh, what about, fellowship? Fellowship. I get better fellowship with my friends at a bar
Yeah,
than I do over in the average parish, that's out there. I mean,
right.
and the fact is, in terms of community for most community for most suburban Catholics,
Mhm.
it's not their parish, it's where they work, it's their neighbors, and they form bonds of social fellowship with those folks more than they do with the people. The parish is just where they go to get their sacraments, all
Right.
right? Because they have still a basic faith on a basic level, whatever it might be. But it's not a place that they really connect to as a place of fellowship and community. And that's the problem that liberal Catholicism faces. It talked a lot about community and fellowship and all that, but it failed to forge any of it because what it proposed in terms of fellowship, it undercut in terms of its vapid and empty theology, which just drained the life out of any reason for why you should want to be in this organization in the first place.
Do you what would you say? Let me ask it this way. What would you say to somebody who might be watching this and is a liberal Catholic? What would you say to them? And then what would you say to somebody who is a more of a reactionary radical traditionalist? What would be your words for them? And by the way, everybody go ahead and send chat questions. Make sure to send them to @Reason and Theology.
Hey, well, way to set me up.
I know, right?
Way to set me up, but that's okay. Okay, let's start. All right, I'm game. So, what would I say to a liberal Catholic? Well, in some ways it would depend on, sort of what kind of liberal you're talking to. But what I do have many liberal Catholic friends. After all, I was in the academy, and we just all, no matter who we are these days, have a lot of liberal Catholic friends, and I like them. They're nice people. They're kind people. I try not to have enemies. Life is too short to have enemies, and I don't have an ideological hit list. Despite how pugnacious I can be and demonstrative in disagreeing with them, I don't hate them. I love them. They're fine, and I have a good time with them. And what I often do actually say to my liberal friends is not believe this or you're going to go to hell. Believe this in order to come out of hell. Because one of the problems that I've noticed about many of my very liberal friends is that most of them live lives that are in constant crisis mode. They're moving from one crisis to another in their life, whether it's a relationship crisis or job crisis or an existential crisis or a substance abuse crisis, whatever it is, crisis, crisis, crisis. And what it is that they don't really believe in the supernatural power of being liberated from their addictions. They don't really believe in the supernatural grace that the sacraments bring, despite the fact that they go to church or whatever. They give a largely sociological construction to the sacraments, to the church. These are human projections, human creations, in order to sort of help us negotiate our way through life. But they don't really view it as liberative. They don't really view it as the first Christians did, as Christ destroying the principalities and powers. That's what was alluring to those first Christians. It wasn't, believe this or you're going to go to hell. Oh, I guess I better believe. It was, Christ liberated them from the tyranny and the terror of the system of polytheistic principalities and powers under which they resided. And it was liberating to them because when you were liberated from those polytheistic deities, you were also liberated to a certain extent from the political apparatus that that entire system of deities, in a sense, authorized. All right, so there was liberation across the board: political, social, cultural, familial, religious. I say the same thing to my liberal friends today, enmeshed in our absolutely anti-life culture that is dominated by the resurgence of these strong gods, as Rusty Reno calls them in his book, although we give a slightly different take to it. And I would say to them, believe in Christ in order to come out of hell, because he liberates. And it is the church that contains that message, the church and her sacraments and in her orthodox teachings. You embrace those and you will be transformed. Now, to To my reactionary friends, to the radical traditionalists, I would say simply, brother, sister, come up higher. You are not wrong. Your instincts are sound. You have the faith. You have so much that you should be grateful for and thankful for in your Catholic faith. Let us sheathe our swords. Let us make common cause together to bring the church to where it needs to be. And let's stop weaponizing one period of the church against another period of the church, because that's not going to get us anywhere. So, my dear brothers and sisters, I am begging you, if you are radical traditionalists of that kind of very venomous sort that is out there, stop sending money to Taylor Marshall by clicking on his stuff. Stop viewing stuff like that on the internet because it empowers it. Join hands with people who are also traditionalists, but maybe not quite in the same way you are. And stop demonizing everything that you see around you, because it's not healthy, it's not good. Not everything is a demon, and not everything in the modern church is horrible. There are shoots of green grass here on our side too, and we can work with those.
Well said. Now, this one is another super chat. By the way, thank you for that super chat from Michael. Can of Worms, is there too much of an obsession regarding hell, von Balthasar, the Nouvelle Theologie, among many traditional Catholics? Enjoy your blog on the issue.
Oh, so Michael reads my blog, and so he's setting me up here too, because he knows, that. But that's why I love coming on these podcasts, because I like being set up. So I'm just joking. I think there is. I've written many blogs about this obsession that so many of the radical traditionalists seem to have with Hans Urs von Balthasar, who, by the way, was the theologian I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. Because Balthasar, in a famous book, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved, speculated that we can and should hope that God will eventually save everyone. Now, the German title of the book is Was dürfen wir hoffen? And it's mistranslated as Dare We Hope. It's better translated as What are we allowed to hope for? So Balthasar was trying definitely to stay within the boundaries of orthodoxy, staying within the boundaries of faith. He said, what does Revelation and the church's teaching allow us to hope for with regard to the salvation of sinners? And he reaches the rather controversial conclusion, based on the fact the church asks us to pray for this, and God says it's his will in 1 Timothy, that we can and should hope for the salvation of all. This really sets some of these traditionalists off. And so I've written a lot against how this is part of the romanticization of the past. They want to return to this old-fashioned, hardline Augustinian massa damnata view, where most people are damned. The majority of human beings are going to hell. And outside of the Catholic Church, you can certainly be saved, but it's really hard. Really hard. And so for the most part, they have a very narrow vision of that Latin statement, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. Now, there's no doubt that in the history of the church, there have been interpretations given to that verse that are very narrow. And there have been interpretations of salvation that have tended in the massa damnata direction. But starting really in the 19th century, the church herself has begun to move decidedly away from that way of thinking into ever more, I hate to use this language, don't misunderstand it, ever more inclusive forms of salvation, a more inclusive Christology, and a broader sense of the possibility that God's salvific will does exist outside of the church in many, many ways. All of it comes through Christ and through the church, and thus the church is necessary for salvation and is Christ. All grace is Christic. But the church has moved in a slightly different direction, and Balthasar was aware. But the radical traditionalists hate this. And I'm just not certain that this is as I say in my blogs, I don't have a whole lot of skin in this game. Nobody really knows the numbers in the next life. I don't like to engage in eschatological census taking. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. And that's why I tend to like Balthazar's view that we should at least hope that all are saved, while it's still acknowledging damnation is a real possibility, especially for me. I just don't get this new fixation on we need to double down on hell. It's like more hell cowbell, please. Bong bong. We need more hell cowbell, like that old Saturday Night Live skit. And I just don't see it. And they're also, for that reason, love to go after Bishop Robert Barron, because Barron has been very outspoken about his support for Balthazar's view. And so they don't like Robert Barron either. And, I like Robert Barron. He's a friend of mine. I'm actually going to be on his show next week. So for the sake of full disclosure. But yeah, I have a problem with a lot of that.
This one is from the Castman. By the way, thank you also for the super chat. Some traditionalists claim that young Catholics prefer the traditional Latin Mass. I'm wondering if there are any actual statistics to back up this claim. Most TLM parishes that I've seen have a pretty even old-young ratio. What say ye?
I think this is a really good question. It is the $1 million question that we need to be asking right now. The Pope, instead of sending a poll out to the bishops asking for their views on the TLM, a poll, by the way, which should be made transparent and public in order for us to know what the real responses were, he should have asked his bishops to do a detailed diocesan-wide synod or study or census of who actually attends the traditional Latin Mass on a regular basis, and to actually do a study, a sociological study, a theological study of why people are attending this Mass and in what numbers and what's the ratio of breakdown of old to young. Because I hear all the time that young people are attracted to this Mass. Now, I don't know if I'm sure that's true on some level, but in terms of ratios, with the broader world of the youth in the Catholic Church, I'd like to know. Because the fact is, I think a lot of this reporting about the surge in these numbers comes from the traditionalists themselves. And I can understand why they would think this, because there are so few traditional Latin Mass parishes compared to all the Novus Ordo parishes out there, that you're going to get a more concentrated number of people at each one of these TLM Masses, because there are fewer venues and fewer locations. So it attracts people from all over. So I think if you attend those Masses with regularity, you can get a false sense of the popularity of the traditional Latin Mass, I think, for a broad cross-section of people. Because my hunch is this. My hunch is if you were to take a poll of church-going Catholics, not of Catholics in general, but of devout church-going Catholics, that 20% of Catholics that still go to Mass on a regular basis, if you were to take a poll of them, I think you would find that the vast and overwhelming majority of them prefer Mass in the vernacular and would not want to see a return of the traditional Latin Mass. I support Mass in the vernacular, but I, like the traditionalists, would like to see elements of the TLM imported in the Novus Ordo, like Mass ad Orientem, altar rails, communion while kneeling on the tongue, more Gregorian chant, and so you get the picture. I would like to see that, and I think many devout Catholics would like to see that too. But I don't think a majority of them, or even an overwhelming majority of them, would want simply for the Church to return us to the traditional Latin Mass as the ordinary form of the Eucharist. So no, I don't buy the argument that young people are flocking to the TLM in droves to the exclusion of Novus Ordo liturgy. There are some very vibrant Novus Ordo parishes out there. And by the way, Newman centers. You want to look at vibrant young people in the church? Go to really good Newman centers on our secular university campuses, and you will see Novus Ordo parishes thriving with young people in them. I attended Newman Center when I went to the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, as a freshman in 1978, because I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska. And I attended an excellent Newman Center there, filled with devout young Catholics. It was a Novus Ordo Mass all the way through, and it was even a Novus Ordo Mass with 70s bells and whistles, guitars and stuff that I wasn't particularly cotton to. But the church was packed, and it produced vocations like crazy. It sent me to the seminary along with 25 other guys in 1 year. So this notion that a Novus Ordo parish cannot attract young people and does not attract young people, I think is false. And I think a false narrative is emerging that says we need to double down on the TLM masses, otherwise we're going to lose the youth. I'm not buying that argument.
Dr. Chapp, I want to invite you to put in a plug for anything that you want to direct our listeners and viewers to, and any closing thoughts that you may have.
Well, I'm obviously just going to put a plug in for my blog, GaudiumEtSpes22.com. For listeners that don't know, Gaudium et Spes 22, Section 22, is that part of Gaudium et Spes, which is a Vatican Council document that says you can't understand human beings unless you understand Christ. So it's very Christocentric. That's why I called the blog that. So I would direct your viewers, listeners, to the blog. I would also like to direct your listeners and viewers to any podcast or venue that is out there that you can find that breathes the fresh air of a balanced sanity. And that's what I try to do with my blog. I think that's what you're doing, Michael, here, which is why I was so excited when I got the invite, because I watch your show all the time. That's not to say I can be crazy, as you can see. I mean, I'm not exactly, straight in the middle. I'm more definitely right of center. But you know what I mean? I would ask your viewers, just try to avoid the crazies. Can we agree with that? Can we just drop the crazies?
That's one way to put it. I definitely agree with you there. Dr. Chapp, this has been incredibly fun and very informative. I want to have you back on.
Absolutely. I would be willing. Yes, absolutely.
I think there's quite a few topics that we could talk about, and I think everybody enjoyed it as well. So I'm definitely going to talk to you off the air about having you on again.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share this on your social media. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. See y'all soon for our second video where I'm going to be critiquing some of the content of Jay Dyer. God bless.